Marcus is 58 years old, and it's 7:40 on a Tuesday morning in Detroit. He's standing in his kitchen, in the same house he's lived in for 11 years, alone, making one cup of coffee, not two. The record player in the living room is already warming up, the needle resting near a Marvin Gaye album he's played 1,000 times. His sneakers are lined up by size and color along the hallway wall, 40-some pairs, none of them worn more than a handful of times. There's a PlayStation controller sitting on the arm of his recliner, charged and ready before he's even had breakfast. His mail is stacked in 3 neat piles on the counter, sorted a certain way that only makes sense to him. Nobody else's coat is on the hook by the door. Nobody else's toothbrush is in the bathroom cup. He turns the volume up 2 clicks, no more, no less, the same 2 clicks every single morning. From the outside, a scene like this is easy to interpret. A grown man, alone in his house, surrounded by sneakers and video games, no wife, no kids, no ring on his hand. People pass a quick judgment on a life like that, without knowing a single detail underneath it. They call him selfish, or stuck, or scared of responsibility, like adulthood is a test he simply refused to take. The word gets used behind his back at family gatherings, and sometimes it gets said right to his face, man-child, like he never finished becoming who he was supposed to be. It's a label that gets handed to a lot of Black Gen X men, without much curiosity about how they actually got there. But that interpretation may be missing something important underneath the surface. The problem is that the exact same behavior can mean something completely different depending on what a person lived through to get there. A man surrounded by things he chose and fully controls isn't automatically a man running from adulthood. Sometimes what looks like arrested development is actually a very specific, very earned kind of peace. Sometimes the same silence that looks like loneliness from a doorway is the quietest a person has ever felt inside their own life. The world sees a man who never grew up, but sometimes what looks like refusing to grow up is actually a man who grew up too fast the first time and is finally slowing down. People see sneakers, records, and video games, and they assume immaturity without asking a single question. But sometimes those objects are the only things in a man's life that were never asked of him, never rationed, never taken away halfway through wanting them. What looks like a man frozen in adolescence can actually be a man quietly reclaiming a childhood he never fully got to have. And this is not some abstract person you have never encountered in your own life. You probably know a man exactly like this. Maybe your uncle, maybe your older cousin, maybe a man from your father's generation who everyone talks about, but nobody really asks. He's the one who shows up to every cookout with something new on his feet and nothing new to say about his personal life. Family jokes about him softly, calls him still living like a bachelor, and moves right on to the next topic. Nobody stays on the question long enough to actually hear an answer. And if you want to understand him, you have to look at the world he built when nobody else was watching. Walk into his house, and you'll notice the sneakers are arranged like a small museum, not a closet full of shoes. You'll notice the record collection is organized by year, not by mood, the way someone organizes something they treat like personal history. You'll notice the remote never leaves a specific spot on the armrest, and nobody in this house is allowed to move it. His refrigerator has exactly what he wants in it, and nothing anyone else ever asked him to buy. Even his silence has a shape to it, a kind of order that took him decades to build for himself. Show the environment before you try to explain the personality, because the environment already tells you what he's protecting. Every object in that house is something he chose without negotiating, without compromising, without anyone else's opinion overruling his own. The order in his home isn't stiffness for its own sake, and it isn't about being difficult either. It's evidence of a man who spent a very long time not having control over very much at all. Peace, autonomy, privacy, and a sense of safety all live quietly inside that arrangement, even if he never uses those exact words to describe it. And if this already feels familiar, stay with me for the next few minutes because the reasons behind it go back further than most people realize. Before we get there, if any part of this sounds like someone in your own family, sit with that for a second while you keep listening, because the next part explains exactly why he became this way. But that still leaves the bigger question hanging in the air. Why does a grown man need this much control over such small, ordinary things in his life? Where did this need for total ownership over his own space actually come from in the first place? What happened earlier in his life that made an empty, quiet house feel like an achievement instead of a lack? To understand that, you have to go back to the environment that shaped him long before he ever had a place of his own. Because the man standing in that kitchen today was built inside a very different world, one most people never think to ask him about. Marcus grew up in the late 1960s and 70s in a 3-bedroom house with 2 parents, 4 siblings, and a grandmother who lived with them for years. 6 people shared 1 bathroom, and privacy was not a concept anyone in that house had time to seriously discuss. His father worked 2 jobs through most of Marcus's childhood, exhausted most evenings, present but rarely emotionally available to talk. His mother managed the household like a small running operation, and every single child had a job, a role, a responsibility from an early age. Marcus was the oldest boy, which meant he was watching his younger siblings before he was even old enough to understand what he was quietly missing. His bedroom was shared with 2 brothers, and he didn't get his own space until he was almost 17 years old. For a lot of black families of that generation, this kind of household wasn't unusual. It was survival, shaped by decades of economic exclusion, redlining, and a labor market that gave black fathers fewer options and much longer hours. Many households leaned heavily on older children, especially oldest sons in large households, to help hold the family together while both parents worked to keep everyone fed and housed. Personal space, personal time, and personal choice were often luxuries the family simply couldn't afford to prioritize. What Marcus didn't have was quiet, privacy, or the freedom to spend money on something just because he genuinely wanted it. What he learned to value, often without ever saying it out loud, was control over the smallest, most personal parts of his own life. What many men like him seek as adults is exactly what Marcus has now, a space nobody else gets to touch or rearrange without his permission. And when you grow up learning that something is rare, you often understand its value very differently once you finally have it. That is where the psychology of a man like this actually begins to make sense. When someone spends years managing everyone else's needs before they've had the chance to develop their own identity, ownership can eventually start to feel like recovery rather than selfishness. When a child never got to choose what shoes they wore, or what music played in the house, or when they got a moment of quiet, adulthood can become less about growing up and more about finally growing into himself. For Marcus, sneakers, records, and an untouched living room aren't symbols of arrested development. They're symbols of a childhood he's quietly finishing on his own terms, decades later than everyone around him expects. Control, in that context, isn't about being difficult, it's about finally being the one who decides. Complex psychology should sound like a truth people already felt but never had the words for, and this is exactly one of those truths. The clothes and the sneakers aren't vanity, they're autonomy made visible, something he can look at every day and know that he chose it himself. And this personal explanation isn't only something Marcus feels privately in his own living room, it shows up in a much broader, well-documented pattern across black men of his generation. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one man's kitchen in Detroit. Researchers studying black men of the silent generation and early Gen X have pointed repeatedly to the long-term psychological effects of what's called parentification, when children are pushed into adult responsibilities far earlier than their peers. Census data from recent decades shows black men are more likely than most other demographic groups to marry later in life or not marry at all, and researchers studying these marriage trends point to a mix of economic barriers, family history, and personal caution shaped by watching relationships strain under financial pressure. Some studies have also linked early caregiving burdens in childhood to a stronger adult preference for solitude and routine, especially among men who never had a stable, predictable environment growing up. None of this proves any single man's exact story on its own, but together it shows Marcus is far from alone in this quiet, common pattern. But numbers can only tell you so much about what any of this actually feels like day to day. The data explains the pattern from a distance, but daily life shows what that pattern actually feels like from the inside, hour by hour. On an ordinary Saturday, Marcus wakes up without an alarm, makes his coffee exactly the way he likes it, and spends 2 full hours cleaning sneakers that are already clean, just because the ritual calms something in him. He calls his mother every single Sunday at the same time, without fail, a habit 30 years deep that nobody in the family questions anymore. When his sister visits with her kids, he's warm, funny, and genuinely present, the uncle who remembers every birthday and shows up early to every graduation. When the house goes quiet again after they leave, something in his shoulders visibly relaxes, and he doesn't apologize for that feeling anymore. At work, colleagues describe him as reliable, easygoing, and impossible to rattle, a man who somehow never seems rushed by anything. But there is another side of this story that deserves to be acknowledged honestly and without flinching, because the same need for control that gave Marcus his peace can, in other men, curdle into something much closer to permanent avoidance. Solitude that's chosen with intention is very different from isolation that happens by default, without a person ever really deciding it. Independence that started out as recovery can slowly turn into a wall that nobody, not even the man himself, remembers building brick by brick. Some men use the language of peace to avoid the discomfort of ever being truly known by another person, and that avoidance can quietly cost them real connection for decades without them noticing. A closet full of sneakers can be a comfort, or it can be a substitute for a life that never got built alongside someone else. So the question is not whether staying single or staying attached to a carefully controlled life is inherently good or bad. The real question is where healthy self-protection ends and quiet, creeping disconnection actually begins. The problem was never solitude itself, and it never needed to be treated like an illness. The problem is when solitude becomes the only place a person has ever felt genuinely safe enough to exist in. The problem isn't a full sneaker closet or a carefully organized record collection sitting in the living room. The problem is when those objects become substitutes for relationships instead of small comforts that exist alongside them. The problem isn't independence, and it was never really about independence at all. The problem is mistaking needing nobody for the exact same thing as being fully healed. So if you're the person being described right now, or you recognize your uncle, your father, or even yourself somewhere in this story, here's what I want you to hear clearly. Nobody is asking you to give up the peace you spent decades building, and you earned every bit of the control you now have over your own life. But peace and connection were never actually opposites, and you don't have to choose permanently between the two of them. Keep 2 or 3 people close, the kind who would genuinely notice if you went quiet for 2 weeks straight, the kind you could call at 2 in the morning if something in your life went seriously wrong. Let 1 or 2 people all the way in, even if it feels unfamiliar after so many years of quietly managing everything alone. You don't have to dismantle the peace to make room for someone. You just have to leave the door slightly open. And maybe that's what most people miss when they look at a man like Marcus from the outside, standing alone in his kitchen with his coffee. Because when you understand everything that came before that Tuesday morning, the scene starts to look completely different than it did at the very beginning. At the start, it looked like a grown man refusing to become an adult, alone with his sneakers and his silence. Now, it looks like a man who spent his entire childhood taking care of everyone else, finally taking care of himself. Being alone in that kitchen was never proof that he never grew up. It was proof that he finally got the chance to.